Okay, perfect. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Westhaver, who is he's a owner of ForestWise Environmental Consulting out of Salmon Arm, and his biography, the full biography, is on the back of the agenda. But he's one of the originators of Canada's National FireSmart program. He's been working in the area of forest field management, wildfire risk reduction for 30 years, looking at wildland-urban interface issues. And the original Partners in Protection Association. Some of us may remember that name of that group from many decades ago. He's been a director and an executive of that organization, and he's led many initiatives, including production of the 1996 FireSmart Protecting Your Community from Wildfire Manual, which many of us, I think, are familiar with. Much of his 34-year career has been with Parks Canada, as a senior wildland fire manager, where, among other duties, he was a certified wildfire behavior analyst, and he's well experienced as a wildland-urban interface practitioner. I'm going to leave it at that. His fuller bio is on the back of the agenda, but it's my pleasure to turn it over to Alan, and he's going to do his presentation. So keep your questions and thoughts towards the end, and then, like I noted before, there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. Alan. Alan, are you on mute?
I'm sorry. I was, me too. So it's an honor to be with you, a pleasure to meet you all, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you and share some thoughts. Thanks for bringing us back to the start of the slideshow, Mike, and also for throwing out that little very subtle challenge that this should be the best of 3 presentations. So we'll try to do that today. It's great to have this chance to help you kick off the start of your wildfire season, or as I kind of think of it, as the beginning of the wildfire risk reduction season, to you all. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your issues and sharing some thoughts with you. So go ahead, please, Mike. Thanks. I want to start off by handing out some real kudos for I'm excited to see and really understand the value of the organization, the forum that you've created and that you're all part of here and focused on wildfire. That's a tribute to the Fraser Basin Council and to all of you. I think it's a very important aspect, and really working together in these kinds of partnerships are the essence of what FireSmart has always been and hopefully will always be. You might wonder why there's a picture of, included a picture of the Lone Ranger here. That's not me. The point of that is that there is no such thing as a Lone Ranger when it comes to FireSmart and risk reduction. It's very much depends on the partners, the partnership, and working together. And the other side of that coin is that there's no silver bullet. Being FireSmart and surviving wildfires intact is a combination of lots of different things, and you can't just pick one and rely on that. So kudos to the forum. I see it's a good group of people. It strikes me that if there's a gap at all, that's the level of involvement by the public, and that's maybe something we can talk about. Go ahead, Mike. Thanks. So kind of as a bit of a roadmap for today's presentation, I want to talk about some of the basics and my views of things about the wildland-urban interface. We want to cover some of the things that we do know for sure, or lessons to be learned because they're not universally adopted or understood, that's for sure. And we want to move on into some of the actions, some of the solutions, in particular in widespread areas like the Clearwater, where you've got a lot of agricultural and rural settings, ranching, a lot of people on acreages, as well as settlements built up, more traditional built up areas, and talk about moving on to, we want to hear what's bugging you and some of your issues so we can have a good discussion at the end. Thanks, Mike. So I want to touch base here in terms of all of you I recognize as being experienced land managers, and that was a big part of my role with national parks for many years. Mike was kind enough to send along the minutes of past meetings, so I was able to take a look at the kinds of activities that you're working with, that you're concerned about in the roundtable, and pretty familiar to me in terms of working at landscape scale, fuel modification, fire breaks, working with your neighbors, trying to synchronize harvesting patterns with what's best for fire on the landscape, and even to some extent prescribed burning. And it seems to me that you're being very effective with the tools that us land managers have at our disposal, the kinds of resources we have. But I want to focus today's presentation on trying to bridge down to a finer scale of land management, the one that's more concerned with private lands and working with residents. It's an area where we as land managers have a lot less control, direct control, but you shouldn't underestimate at all the kind of influence, the important influences that you can have on what happens at those scales too. And in terms of the wildland urban interface fire problem, that's the level that's most effective in reducing wildfire losses. So it is important to bridge down to that level and incorporate it in some way. So also kind of a big picture, it's important for us to keep our fuel modifications in perspective. I've spent, although I'm retired, I've spent the last 4 winters continuing our fuel modification work around the town of Jasper and the Jasper Park Lodge up there. But, the objectives of fuel modification, we are manipulating the fuel load and the continuity of fuels and all of the things which dictate the intensity of fire behavior. And that's a good thing. Our goal is to get fire down, drop it out of the grounds and put it on the ground where we can deal with it more effectively. But the big thing that we do, maybe even the most important thing through fuel modification, is that we're limiting the amount of ember production that comes out of that wildland fuel. It doesn't have to be forest, it can be brush or grassland too, but we're limiting the amount of embers that are going to come downwind and land on built up areas. And we have to also realize that all of that work has no impact whatsoever on the flammability or the vulnerability of residential fuels. I mean, by residential fuels, I'm talking about the structures themselves or the area around homes or structures, which have hundreds of other kinds of fuels that range from fifth wheels to firewood piles, I guess. Thanks, Mike. So it's also, we've got people that are very much dedicated to disaster management and emergency management in the audience here today. And and especially after 2017 and 2018 in British Columbia here, we heard a lot from the BC Flood and Wildfire Review. We hear oftentimes the terms resilient communities. Our goals are having sustainable communities, but really the best definition of that I've ever heard is those are communities that bounce back more quickly after some kind of a disastrous situation. And I guess more often than not, where we live, that disaster is a wildfire. And kind of the question that comes to mind, well, what makes a community more resilient? How can they bounce back more quickly? And the real kind of the Charlie Brown logical answer to that, it's because they suffer less. There's less impact, and they have a lot less to recover from. You know, a disaster can come and go, and they can go back to work next week or tomorrow. That's what we're really shooting for. Go ahead, Mike. Thanks. So, by the way, there's lots of different definitions out there in terms of what is the wildland-urban interface. And sometimes these definitions create a lot of confusion amongst people. You know, they start to interpret this as the wildland-urban interface being that pencil-thin line between the built-up areas and the forest. That's often the way we teach it, in fact, but you know, this gives them the misunderstanding that, well, I live in the middle of town. It's not important. I'm home free. That's not the case. I think the better, more operational and realistic view of a definition, it's anywhere where structures or buildings or homes are located in places where the flames, the radiant heat, or the embers of a wildfire could ignite those homes. I think that puts a better picture on things to everyone. Thanks, Mike. So, and kind of where do we stand now? I think this is really important. This is the message that we need to be conveying to everybody. We're living in a different world now than it was 30 years ago. And these are trends, these three factors on the left here, you know, the amount of development that we have in forested or wildland areas of any kind, the health of the forest, particularly the rising fuel loads due to forest insects and diseases, and the multiple impacts of climate warming on fire in particular are trends that are increasing, and we'll see the amount of area burned. It's doubled in the last 30 years. It's going to double again in the next 20 to 30 years. So what we're seeing is not exceptional circumstances. This is the way it's going to be. And if wildfire mitigations aren't in place, we're headed for a lot more disasters. And I think that's what makes this an urgent issue. So, and we've all, you know, there's many fire managers in the audience here. I think we're familiar with these being kind of the big things that are changing, but really the whole world is shifting beneath us. But the most important things to keep in mind here are that the frequency of when fuels dry out to a pretty extreme extent, and extended droughts included, but also the fact that we're seeing a lot more radical winds. That combination is what, you know, really puts us in a bad spot. We'll talk more about that shortly. Thanks. Mike. So another perspective is to consider is that I think by and large wildland fire is not conveyed accurately in the media. They're not helping our perception by and large when they convey and paint this picture of fire being some kind of an unstoppable tsunami or tidal wave that just rolls over everything. And, you know, the interpretation of that to the public is that they're pretty helpless to do with that. And we need to fight that image. And we have the knowledge to do that. That's all part of FireSmart and any fire education program. Go ahead, Mike. So on the other side of that, we have a lot of science about wildland-urban interface and fire in general. And we know that fire only spreads when the conditions for combustion are met. And that's true for any fire anywhere. We know that from our experience with campfires, but it's just as true for the wildland-urban interface. And we also know that even the most intense wildfires can't ignite a wood structure or a wood wall from further away than 30 meters. So that 30-meter distance is kind of a magic number that's reflected in virtually all of the standards and guidelines, but it's not well understood. Mike, thanks. Well, the other thing that we know now, again, it's still not widely accepted. Well, it's accepted, but still it's not understood by everyone that embers are the factor, the component of fire that ignite the vast majority of homes. It's not the big flames. That bottom left-hand picture there is a seat cushion that I discovered in Fort McMurray during my work there. Calculates out to 600 burn holes per square meter. That means 600 burning embers, flaming or smoldering per square meter in that instance. And the real issue is that they pile up in corners. But that's what's happening across the entire area of the wildland-urban interface, particularly closer to the fire. So that's the thing that we have to be worried about. Go ahead, Mike. I think there's always some value in looking at the past and lessons from the past and thinking about how things have changed. In the bottom left-hand picture is my former hometown, and actually where my wife's family lived for several generations, Fernie, BC, as it looked on August 2nd in 1908. And at the bottom right is, of course, a picture we're all more familiar with at Fort McMurray in 2016. But when you think about all the advances that we've made in fire management, in terms of our technology, our science, our ability to predict, detect fires, fight fires, the advent of even having the ability to modify fuels, we've got to the point where we're 97% effective. Only about 3% of fires aren't extinguished before they reach a hectare or two in size. And that's a remarkable achievement. But there's a big contradiction with the kind of results that happen when we get these wildland interface fire situations. Nothing much has changed there. And that's our issue in a nutshell. Go ahead, Mike. Thanks. So we also know that there's a common denominator in these big fire losses. Whether we're talking about Australia or California, Texas or Canada, the common denominators are high intensity fire, extreme winds, high crown fire behavior, developing convection columns that lift embers high into the air and draw a lot of them into the sky, and spot fires, which are, a key mechanism for how wildfires spread forward, but also the same process is happening in built up areas. Embers don't care where they land. So all of those factors contribute to the massive production of embers and their ability to travel relatively long distances. There's no question that the vast majority of embers land within 1/2 to 1.5 kilometers from the front of the wildfire, but they do travel. Go ahead, Mike. So another thing that is critically important to understand, especially for the public, is that there are limits to any kind of response. In Canada, we've been working for 100 years to fine tune and increase our abilities to fight fires. But on those days when fires taking huge runs with big winds, virtually all capabilities are exceeded. And there's no system in the world that's capable of dealing with those days. No amount of resources on the ground or in the air. What we really need more of is teamwork focused on mitigation. This is the kind of elbow grease. Most of it's little things that will make the difference to those outcomes. Go ahead. So to achieve those kind of outcomes, you know, we can't just keep doing the same things. We have to change in a fairly drastic manner our approach to this problem. And if you look carefully at this picture that I took in Fort McMurray, you can see the barbell there with the weight bar. You know, over the years, we've been continually raising our bar on our capabilities, but we really need to get to the point of bending that bar or maybe breaking it altogether and taking a different focus, one that includes mitigation to a higher degree. And here we have a little quote on the bottom right by the ex-mayor of Fernie in 1908, who was pretty prophetic when he said that we'll learn this lesson, or others need to learn this lesson. And he was talking about managing fuels and the vulnerability of communities in his article. You can look it up in the Victoria Times if you like. Go ahead, Mike. So that's one of my appeals to you today is, you know, there are 4 pillars of emergency management. We put a lot of eggs in the planning, preparedness, and response basket. We, you know, putting an unbelievable amount in recovery, maybe, you know, because that's been essential. But I guess my appeal is that we increase, you know, our efforts and energy that's going into mitigation. We've always had fire prevention programs, although they're considerably smaller than the other 2. But mitigation is kind of the tag on to prevention. And that's where we need to, it's the old ounce of prevention, something that all of our grandmas taught us long ago. But that's where I think we need to shift some of our emphasis. Thanks, Mike. Go ahead. And that, of course, is FireSmart. That's what FireSmart was all about. That is the definition of FireSmart, interface wildfire loss reduction. And we're really blessed here in British Columbia. Of all the Canadian provinces, BC is leading the way in terms of the programs, the information that's available to people. We need to send a big shout out to Kelsey Winter and the BC FireSmart Committee, what they're doing. And I really encourage you to log on to the BC FireSmart website. It's just amazing, and it's getting better every day. There's a lot of resources there. And BC's leading the country in that department for sure. Thanks. So let's skip over some lessons learned here, Mike, shall we? And here's the one that I think is probably the most important for us as managers or administrators or elected officials to understand. This is a sequence, a pattern of how wildland-urban interface disasters develop, and it repeats time and again. One study in the recent study in the States looked at 15 of the biggest events that have happened, you know, all of them over several hundred homes. And this pattern held true in virtually all of them. The top 3 boxes here are describing the conditions that are prevailing. First of all, top left, you know, we have those extreme conditions that we talked about. The second box, we do have an ignition and a fire that's spreading, you know, according to those conditions, high rates of spread, convection columns, ground fire behavior. And in the top right, that kind of fire comes into the proximity of a built up area, a built environment, and it is exposing that community to embers. You know, virtually all communities have some kind of fire break, roads. You know, it doesn't take much to create that 30-meter buffer that clearance that can't be penetrated by flames or is too great for radiant heat to impact us. But what we see is a rapid ignition, a lot of homes igniting in a very short span of time. And it's easily conceivable that that could be dozens or hundreds within an hour. Think of Kelowna, think of Slave Lake, think of Fort McMurray. That's what was happening, particularly, and the closer the fire gets to town, the greater that zone of multiple ignitions is, the wider that zone is. And what happens from that point on is that any conceivable amount of firefighting resources we have are just overwhelmed. It takes, Chief, you can probably tell us, three or four vehicles, engines to suppress a single home. It doesn't matter how many we have. They may not even be safe for them to get there. They may not be able to get there, but those resources become overwhelmed. And as the fire progresses into the next stage, which is moving not just independent ignitions, but now the fire is moving from one structure to another independent of anything that's happening in the forest. And our resources get stretched further and further, and a disaster evolves. So that's the pattern. That's what we worry about. There is some good news. Next slide, please, Mike. And the good news there, top right corner, is that there is a weak link in this chain. It can be broken. It's not inevitable. And that link is, simply put, if fewer homes are vulnerable to ignition, fewer homes ignite, and then our firefighters are capable and able to deal with that to a greater extent. So that's the weak point, and that's the change that we need to make. It's all to do with the ignition potential of the homes in our built environment. Go ahead, Mike, please. So I got a slide or two to illustrate those two phases that's going on between the top right box and the first one on the left. And this is from a dash cam video. I bet you lots of you have seen this from, go to dash cam Fort McMurray. This is the best teaching tool ever. Anyway, this is just a screenshot from that. It shows, this is Beacon Heights Drive, the crown fire that roared through the modified fuels to the edge of town. You can see it on the left. It's dying right back. It's done its thing. The big flames are gone. None of those homes are on fire at this point in view here. But you can see embers on the back of this truck. You can see embers in the gutters. You can see spot fires on the left, and you can see two spot fires in front of two out of three homes there on Beacon Heights Drive. In flower beds, one of them, both of them actually had wood chips beneath combustible young junipers, pine tree, connected to a wood deck. In 45 seconds later in this video, both of these homes are at least 50% involved in fire. You also see two fire trucks speeding by on the left. They're going to deal with another problem. Anyway, that's the first stage of ignition. And in my examination, virtually all of the homes along that street had similar vulnerabilities, similar potential for spot ignitions that would spread to the home, and none of them ignited by the direct flames. At the end of the day, they all burned. They were gone. Next slide, Mike, thanks. And from that point on, fire spreads into the community, moving independently of forest fuels from one structure to the next, from one home ignition zone to another, from my front yard to your backyard. But I just want to mention, you're not a big urban area there in Clearwater. You have small developed areas where that process happens, but this process can happen just as easily in a rural area. And I this is an aerial photograph of my grandfather's homestead. And typically, ranches and farms have a lot of buildings, main structures, outbuildings. The same exact process can happen here. Embers find a weak spot, and that structure that's burning spreads far to adjacent structures. Go ahead, Mike. So all of this has led to identification and standards and guidelines for what we call the home ignition zone. Basically, these are 4 concentric zones that are arrayed around a home or a barn in increasingly wider circles. And as you get closer to the home, of course, the degree of managing fuels needs to be more intense. It doesn't mean that all vegetation or all objects have to be removed from all of these zones, not at all. But the guidelines do result in the structure not igniting. And of course, there's guidelines for the structure itself too. Anyway, the home ignition zone is the important zone for all of us. Go ahead. And FireSmart works very similarly to what we're doing on the landscape with fuel modification. We're either reducing or rearranging those fuels. We're reducing the ability of fire to spread on the ground. There may still be flames, but their intensity is way less, and it doesn't ignite the structure. All of that ends with fewer homes igniting and firefighters being way more effective in dealing with what's left, and communities that bounce back quicker. So that's the rationale behind FireSmart. And it makes me really wonder and doubt whether we've been, putting as much emphasis on the home ignition zones as we should. Wildland fire really isn't the problem. It's the vulnerability of those homes that gets us, that creates that cycle and allows it to run to the end, that sequence, I mean. Go ahead, Mike. And Jack Cohen, now retired from the Forest Service, he's got a very succinct way. He's the kingpin. He's the guy that's done the most science, most physics, the most experiments in this whole area. And this is the way he puts it. We don't have a forest fire problem. We have a home ignition problem. And when you start thinking that way, the whole problem comes into focus and we can start seeing solutions. I should mention that Jack and I are both working with the BC Wildfire Service, the BC FireSmart Committee, in developing a technique for studying urban interface disasters and a research team that will go to these fires so that we can learn more. So what did we learn from Fort McMurray? I'll quickly run through a few highlights here so we can get on to solutions. Thanks, Mike. We're going to click fast now. Okay, so that was the basic question that folks at Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, who sponsored my research there, they saw, some homes were burning and others weren't. Why not? So that led to a lot of other questions, but here are some of the conclusions, and we'll just roll through these things. Mike? The first being that in assessing hundreds of homes in Fort McMurray, the ones that survived were those that were rated to be low to moderate hazard according to the FireSmart guidelines. And that no matter how you look at the data, that was the case. So it means that the people that adopted FireSmart practices, that correlated to the survival of their home, period. Next, Mike. And it also demonstrated that the FireSmart guidelines work. And, we looked at lots of different angles, but that's the case. That's the bottom line. Survival isn't a random occurrence. It's not a fluke. There are reasons for it. Any home, like in the bottom right-hand picture, there's actually 2 homes there. in all of Beacon Heights that survived, that was no accident. They were very fire smart, even though all their neighbors were lost. Go ahead. And just a picture to emphasize that thing. In all my searching there, I could only find 2 or 3 homes in all of the 24. Well, I didn't study them all, but I saw 2 or 3 homes in Fort McMurray that I was pretty confident were ignited directly by flames. The rest, I would say it was embers. Go ahead. Okay, yes, embers. They're the big thing. And, you know, the other side of the coin, how do we know this, is there was a lot of unburned vegetation and materials in the city of Fort McMurray, where homes in the middle of them were destroyed. And the fact that the clearance was adequate from what we know. This is a picture of the fire earlier than the last picture about when that fire was crowning. You can see that the flames aren't touching and people are surviving. There's people, you know, guy on the motorcycle is getting a little nervous from the heat, but he wasn't injured. And people are injured or hurt by flames and radiant heat a lot faster than houses are. Go ahead. So that pattern was observed. That's what played out in Fort McMurray in a number of different subdivisions. There were multiple examples of the sequence happening there. Go ahead. We can skip this one, but the point is that, you know, FireSmart guidelines need to be applied uniformly. You just can't pick one, because one glaring factor like this can ignite a brick home. That's that juniper, if it goes, and it's more than likely to, will result in the shattering of that window, collapsing, and fires inside that house. It's gone. Next slide, please. This is important. I've done studies in Fort McMurray, Slave Lake, and Kelowna. And in each of those cases, more than half of all the hazard that shows up on a FireSmart hazard assessment is due to vegetation within 30 meters of our homes. So that's a big factor. We need to pay a lot of attention to that. And it's something that's simply managed. Doesn't mean it all has to go, but it needs to be carefully managed to reduce the risk. Go ahead, Mike. Thanks. Now we can skip over this slide too. And just the point is that a lot of that vegetation is what we choose to plant. It's bad decisions on our part as the residents. So what can we do? Here's a few tips from me, but basically, you know, the thrust of this, the theme behind it all, is that we need to reduce or eliminate the vulnerability to embers. We need to be thinking embers and dealing with that, and not too tough to do. And we need to deal with the rest of the combustible materials that are within that 30 meters of homes. And it's pretty dead simple. Again, Jack says it all. If a home doesn't ignite, they can't burn. And if they don't burn, we don't have a disaster. How do we get there? So I just want to make the point that it's really important to consider when we're looking around our own homes and convince people to look for the places where embers would accumulate. It's the same kind of places that the first snowflakes will, you know, gather on their first windy fall day in nooks and crannies.
Call back. I'm in the middle of a little
and the basis of walls. And we need to deal with those, because that's the same places where leaves and needles and old newspapers will accumulate and blow into over the months ahead of the fire. Go ahead, Mike. So a few words here for rural residents, because I know there's lots of them in your neck of the woods. Let's touch base with a couple of those. Go ahead, Mike. So in rural and agricultural areas, and it's kind of a bit of a dilemma, because the two most important assets that ranchers and farmers have are the grass they grow and the outbuildings they must have in order to run their operations. But both of those can be, provide quite a bit of risk. So, but the FireSmart guidelines that we're encouraging people in urban areas to apply equally well, and are maybe even more important in rural settings. So let's click ahead and see how that works. So as part of our home ignition zone, the first circle around a home is what we call the 1.5 meter non-combustion zone. It doesn't mean that there's nothing there that would burn if you put a drip torch to it, but it means that if they burn, they're not going to expose the structure to flames. And that zone needs to be put around not just your home, but all outbuildings in an agricultural setting need to be set up that way. And they need to be sealed so embers and debris can't get underneath. If embers can get through, the loose garage doors on a Quonset, it's going to burn from the inside out instead of from the outside in. And same thing with grass, most people living in rural areas are good managers of grass and vegetation. Mow that grass once a year in late July, early August, when it starts to cure off. And when it burns, it won't burn with an intensity that's going to challenge your non-combustible zone. Do the same thing around corrals and fences and in ditches where accumulations of grass really become a wick for fire to get to your buildings. Next, please. Another thing that people can do in rural areas is they have a lot of stuff. In order to run their business, they need a lot of stuff. But to manage those combustible things more carefully by putting them inside where they can, or well away from buildings if they can't. And in the longer term, have a plan for relocating forage storage areas, outbuildings, getting rid of buildings that you don't need anymore, trying to move those things downwind or increasing the separation of those. So at worst, you just have embers from those buildings going to other buildings and you don't have issues with flames and radiant heat. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so here's my challenge to you. You have an amazing forum that's working well in many aspects of coordinating and collaborating and communicating with each other. My challenge to you would be to try to expand the circle of that program in ways that will help to motivate and educate residents of your rural and urban areas to attack and work with the risk mitigation for FireSmart. Carry the good fight that you've been fighting against wildfire and fuel, far from developed areas to the next stage and bring it closer to home. Try to enable those residents to adopt programs and ways of doing things that will make a difference to ignition potential of structures. And in the long run, even the short run, start providing firefighters with a big advantage to do their job most effectively. So next slide, I think, Mike. So what's the best thing I can recommend way of doing that? Well, here it is. It's the FireSmart Canada Neighborhood Recognition Program. The point of this program, the whole object of it, which we borrowed from the Americans, called the FireWise program, was that as fire management officers, we were all tapped out. Many communities needed help, but we didn't have enough time or energy possible to deal with all of them. That's what this program is meant to do. It's meant to take a workload off your shoulders, but allow you to have a positive influence to kickstart things. Many people in the BC Wildfire Service have taken the local FireSmart representative workshop. LFRs, as we call them, are the facilitators of this. The idea is they put in a little energy and the community takes off on its own. It becomes its own resident run and functioning FireSmart committee. They develop a plan and they implement their plan during one day of year FireSmart activities. That gets some national recognition. It's which is a big incentive. They can also see the difference they're making. So this program gets quite infectious. And you can find out all about this program, of course, on the BC FireSmart website. And next to last slide, I think here, Mike, is just an example of how this program can work. The city of Fernie, as you all know, unlike most other communities, we knew there's proof positive that the whole community could go again, because it has in the past. They were very worried, but they didn't know what to do. They started up the FireSmart recognition program, and it's having a huge difference. Next slide, Mike. People are now well educated. They know, they can see how fire spreads on their property and could destroy their homes because of what they've learned. They know the pathways that fire could take, and they know the simple things that they can do as a result of participating in this program. One last slide, Mike. Oh, I fibbed, there's two. So here's an example here, kind of, we look at this program as a bit of a pyramid scheme for fire agencies to assist them with risk mitigation and their goals for fire prevention. Started out with a single FireSmart representative working, and since then it's expanded to 3. But this program is now, pardon the pun, it's caught fire in, at this point in time anyway, 17 neighborhoods, which means there's 17 FireSmart committees working towards their own goals and implementing their own plans. That really factors up to more than 2,000 residents are showing up and doing things once a year in their community on a lot of homes. More than a third of the city of Fernie is now engaged in this program. But most of all, most important of all, they're working together in their neighborhood, but most of those people, almost all of them, are taking what they know and implementing it in their own backyards. And this is what the program's designed to do. It's a tool for getting that information and converting it to action. So in a span of about 2.5 years, the program has gone from 0 to, high levels. And there's, even in the places where you'd least expect it, there are 5 or 6 neighborhoods at the ski hill, seasonal residents even, that are implementing this program. So it's good evidence that this program works, and they're up well over 17 neighborhoods now. This is an old slide. Okay, Mike, it's question period. It's time for you, and I'm happy to contribute or just listen in on your conversations.